meeting to order. First, I'd like to welcome Ian Johnson to his first CART meeting. Thank you, Ian. And going on to approval of minutes from May 26th. Do I have a motion to approve?
Second.
You all in favor?
Aye.
Oh, sorry, discussion.
An addition on item 3 under committee reports. I'd like to add the language after what's included in the minutes.
Sorry, once there's a vote taken, we can't go back,
There was no offer for discussion.
but there was a vote taken already.
I'm sorry, but I wasn't given a chance to discuss them. That's not appropriate.
According
Should have called for discussion after a second.
to Robert's rule, once there's a vote taken, we can't go back to the item.
Wait. There should have been a discussion of the minutes. I have some things I'd like to add to the minutes. And I don't see why you're preventing me from doing that.
Following Robert's rule.
I mean, what do? We'll get up and walk out to protest? How do Chair, I don't see how this is appropriate.
According to rules, once there is a vote taken on an item, we cannot go back.
There should have been a discussion after the second. There should have been asked for additions or changes to the minutes after the second. I will submit them in writing. I'm so flabbergasted. I can't be allowed to submit an addition to the minutes of what actually took place in the meeting. Is that what you're preventing me from doing that?
That's not what we're saying. We're saying once there's a vote taken, we cannot go back and take an action on an item that was already an action.
I did not vote on the motion.
Majority of the group did.
I don't recall hearing a majority of the vote. All right, I give up. I just give up. I give up. Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, your pleasure to proceed.
Moving on to item 3, RTA board report.
Excuse me.
Okay, Madam Chair, members of the,
I don't mean to interrupt. I didn't vote. I'd like to abstain because I wasn't actually at the previous meeting. So
Okay, well,
now is the vote complete? Okay.
yeah, okay.
So I would like to record my vote as an opposition to the meeting minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to item 3.
okay, Madam Chair, members of the CART committee, there have been 3 RTA board meetings that have taken place since our last CART committee in May. The most recent of which was on November 3rd. And I'll kind of go through the actions on a meeting by meeting basis. The meeting that took place immediately following the last CART meeting was on June 2nd. At that meeting, we approved the fiscal year 23 budget. We also approved a number of IGAs, including some IGAs that terminated some old agreements and applied those funds to other basically bicycle and pedestrian RTA 41 projects, because that's an area that we're trying to focus on providing additional funding to. So there was additional funding on the City of Tucson's Marianne Cleveland shared use path that was approved, and there was additional funding that was granted to the City of Tucson for its 18th Street, 8th Avenue, South Campbell, Canal Bike Boulevards project. Also, there was an amendment that was made to the Town of Oro Valley's funding agreement for Oracle Road wildlife funding. And there was a IGA that took money off of the Valencia Road RTA 21 project and made it available to the Pascua Yaqui tribe for basically constructing a new bus pullout at the intersection of Valencia and Ignacio Bonilla. Probably the most controversial thing that we dealt with at that meeting was the award of the Sun Shuttle and Sun Shuttle Dial-A-Ride contracts. At that particular meeting, there was no action taken at that meeting. It was actually deferred, and basically what ended up happening was there was quite a bit of discussion about the bidding process and the performance of the incumbent contractor. Following that, there was an affirmation of terms for the Citizens Advisory Committee officers, basically, as we moved into the or beyond the expiration dates that had been applicable to the prior committee, and those were renewed, but there was an affirmation that the officers would remain in their appointed roles. There was a discussion about the CAC and the RTA plan development parameters. Quite a bit of discussion there. We also had conversation, or actually we had action that appointed Mr. Johnson at that meeting to this committee, and we're glad to have you, sir. We reviewed the Auditor General's recommendations to the RTA audit, and that was something that we had presented back to the committee back at that meeting. We talked about RTA project scope revisions on the First Avenue Orange Grove to Ina project and the First Avenue Grant Road to River Road projects, as well as the discussion of the Silver Bell Road project. The board at that point in time recommended that the First Avenue Orange Grove to River Road project and the Silver Bell Road project be deferred. There was also an agreement or a discussion about the Downtown Links project and the request for additional funding there. No action was taken on that. That was the June 2nd meeting. In terms of the August 25th meeting, we revisited several of these issues. We did have some additional actions that took place. We did have our Title VI plan approved. We did authorize the purchase of transit buses for the Sun Shuttle fixed route, and we did award the Sun Shuttle dial-a-ride contract to the incumbent contractor with a number of very specific provisions to require their performance to improve. There was continuing discussion of the cost to complete RTA projects, and we did approve or give authorization to the executive director to execute an amendment to the IGA between the city of Tucson and the RTA for the Downtown Links project, basically enhancing the funding to the tune of about $17.5 million. We had our most recent meeting on November 3rd. We did have a number of IGAs that were approved at that meeting, largely dealing with transit. Had to do with the continuation of SunTrans service, both the expanded services that we offer, as well as the contracted services or the pass-through services that we do on behalf of Pima County, the town of Marana, and the city of South Tucson. We did terminate a wildlife linkages agreement for Tangerine Road. Our expectation is that we'll come back. It was tied to a particular phase. We expect it to be applied to a different phase in a future meeting. We did approve a funding agreement with the town of Oro Valley for a multi-use path project on Naranja Drive between La Cañada and First Avenue. Basically, the RTA is funding the match component of a federal RTAG grant, or Regional Transportation Alternatives Grant. Thank you, sir, everyone. We did also award a contract for the Sun Shuttle Ajo service, which for those of you that don't know, we have a separate contractor that operates on a daily service between Ajo and Tucson, operates dial-a-ride in the Ajo area, provides circulator between Ajo and Y, and we pay for a portion of the service that goes between Ajo, Gila Bend, and Phoenix. Basically, we cover the cost of the mileage within Pima County on that particular service. It's really a lifeline service that we offer to the residents of the Ajo area. It's a joint procurement that we do with Valley Metro because this service also is really focused in the Mag region on providing access between Gila Bend, which is in Maricopa County, and the Phoenix metro area where they require their services. So that's a big project there. We had a conversation about the cost to complete. This has been a standing item as we discuss the RTA, the current RTA plan, what it's going to take to complete the RTA plan, what kind of funding we believe we have available, and we'll have more discussion about that in this meeting. We provided you the materials that were presented to the RTA board as well. The RTA did agree to accept a recommendation from the city of Tucson to delay two of their projects, basically the 22nd Street West project, which is the piece between Keno Boulevard and Interstate 10, and the project, the northernmost phase of the Houghton Road project, which is stage 8 from basically Broadway north to Tanque Verde. Those two projects have been delayed as we look for additional funding opportunities and try to address the funding needs of all of these projects. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I think I've covered it all, probably in too much gory detail, but I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Questions?
I have a question. Like federal infrastructure money, does that come funneled through us, or does that go through the municipalities directly? For instance, like the 22nd Bridge.
Yeah, excellent question, Mr. Long, Madam Chair. The funds can be sought directly by the local governments, and in the case of the 22nd Street project, the city of Tucson has applied directly to the federal government under a grant program. It's basically called the RAISE grant program that is allowed or is made available to facilitate projects that are needing additional funding. That actually received $25 million. It's the largest amount allowed under that RAISE grant offering. My understanding is that they're pursuing additional grant as well on that particular project. But from a broader sense, what happens is the region gets a formulaic distribution of federal funds that we then have the ability to recommend projects for. But in addition to that, and where the real value or where the most of the money is in the recently approved IIJA or Bill Act, whatever you want to call it, is the power in that is in grants that are made available. And for the most part, the individuals that have project components or owners are seeking those grant dollars directly from the federal government. And of course, we're happy to support them if they're consistent with our regional plans for the area. And Mr. Mogami, you may have some other things to add to that.
No, I don't have anything to add other than, yes, most of them are very competitive. And obviously we hope that everybody's gonna pursue those grants.
Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes, very well. Are we aware of any other projects other than the 25 billion, 22nd Street that governments in our area are applying for?
We are aware of the city of Tucson requesting additional funds for that project. In fact, they've got another $50 million request for that very same project under a formula bridge deficiency allocation that they're pursuing on that, because that's an extraordinarily expensive project, and we can talk about that later. That project is in the $145 million range right now for just that piece of it. And I think we had 104 million over the whole corridor from I-10 to the project. We've already built the Keno intersection, so that's it is in need of additional funding. But to your question about other projects or other federal funds that we're aware of, I know that the city of Tucson recently got a low no grant. And in fact, that's one that we jointly participated with them on, where they're buying basically received a grant for 11 additional all electric buses. And we partnered with them because we operate a cutaway fleet, or a fleet of, they're called cutaway vehicles. It's basically what we typically operate is basically an E350 or a F450 chassis with the big transit carriage area. I'm doing a less job describing it, I apologize. But yeah, it's basically a hybrid vehicle that's built from frame and chassis that are provided by the major manufacturers. We have 4 of those that are going to be electric that are going to help us with the Sun Shuttle fleet. And this will be the first time that we've offered that. And in fact, it'll allow us to pioneer a route between the Udall Park and Sabino Canyon Recreation Area, which will turn on or make accessible that park to people who don't have vehicles. So it's a new opportunity for us, and we've partnered with the city of Tucson.
And the last question I have is, there isn't availability of any money to fund any of our existing projects so that we can free that money up for other projects like the ones that we don't have money for.
At this point, we don't have them awarded, but I believe we will be pursuing them quite vigorously as the grant opportunities become available, and we look at the rules associated with the application process. We'll certainly be looking to track down additional funds under that. It's kind of slowly rolling out in pieces, and as those pieces become available, we're encouraging our member jurisdictions to look at which ones they can apply for, and we can support to further the delivery of the RTA plan.
Thanks, Jim.
Check there. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I had a question, Madam Chair, Mr. DeGroote. When the federal infrastructure funds are awarded, is there a certain time limit to program and spend those funds?
Madam Chair, certainly, yeah, there are rules associated with them. They vary somewhat. For instance, if we have our formulaic funds that come down to us every year, we basically have to spend those within the year that they're budgeted. It's kind of a use it or lose it. We oftentimes have to go through some pretty significant efforts to prevent them from, if a project's delayed and we've got the federal funds lined up for that particular year, we can have to go through some pretty big gyrations to try to move money around so that we can preserve those funds. But if once you've obligated a set of funds, then there's a fairly lengthy period of time in which you can draw them down. It's all about obligating them when they're available, and then you have a period of time to draw them.
Are there any more questions? Moving on to item 4, financial update.
Okay. All right. My first PowerPoint of the day. Okay. What I'm going to do is go over where we stand presently in terms of our financial situation. We have been enjoying some pretty good revenues recently. We have this represents our November 22 deposit. Actually, there was a dollar. Apparently, it lost the dollar amount. I don't know what happened to it, but we've been doing very well in our collections. I don't recall the dollar amount offhand, but it's approaching $10 million. If you look at the trend line, you can really see some dramatic changes in the pre and post pandemic era. It's basically almost 2 different rates of growth. You can see the rate of growth that we have approaching the pandemic. That big spike downward represents basically the month of April of 2020, when we were on full on pandemic, and we were in the shutdown mode. And since that time, we've seen some real growth in the rate of or increase in the rate of growth in our revenues. And where we had not seen anything exceed the $10 million point prior to or in terms of a monthly deposit, Prior to the pandemic, we have been verging on that pretty regularly, and in fact have passed through the $10 million monthly deposit amount on a couple of occasions, and I expect we'll see that that trend continue. We're looking right now at the November deposit that represents September revenues. That's the transactions that took place during the month of September. And that during the month of September, if you compare it year over year, it was over a 15% growth. September is typically not a big month for spending. It's basically in the shadow of, from a consumer standpoint, I liken it to, we finished our back to school shopping and we're saving up for Christmas or the holiday season. And that's, kind of how I would characterize it. And it's usually a fairly low revenue month. What we've seen is some pretty good growth. If you look at our growth, this table represents our budget performance. Looking at it from comparing our fiscal 22 actual revenues, which came in at over $110 million. Our budget for this fiscal year was $107 million based upon the last RTA revenue forecast. We hadn't received the one that I'll be speaking to in a moment. When we set that, we typically follow the revenue forecast unless there's a reason to be more conservative. There's really no penalty to be less conservative or no benefit to being less conservative. But you can see our year over year growth and our change to budget in the two columns to the right. Our lowest year over year growth was in July. And again, that represents May sales of only 4.7%. And I'd argue that this is largely tied to the increases in wages that we're seeing in the region, which is also reflected in the costs we're paying. So as we see increased pricing, we're seeing an increased cut of those expenditures for sales tax. This shows table shows a comparison of our year over year revenue collections and the growth rates. As you can see, we've seen quite a bit of growth. Probably our best year pre-recession was 2008, when we collected almost $75 million. Then we didn't see that broken until 2016. So that's how long we were in, below our pre-recession revenue rates in absolute dollars. We're now at 110, and right now we're on a pace to probably be more on the $117 million range if we continue at the rate we're currently collecting. And again, our budget is 107 this year. Right now, as you can see, the growth rates, with the pandemic, 2020, modest growth, even in spite of the negative growth that we saw in March and April, when the pandemic was first hitting. We came back and we're still posted a 3.6% growth rate in fiscal year 2020, and almost 12% and almost 11% since. We're on pace right now at about 8% right now is where we're at in terms of our current year over year growth, at least as we've seen it in the first 5 months of the year. Okay, now I'm going to move on to our updated revenue estimate. This is something that we've been doing annually since the pandemic hit. In the past, we'd only been doing it triannually. They really haven't changed that much, but with all of the dynamics of the recession, or rather the pandemic, we've been looking at updating this more regularly because things are changing very rapidly. This estimate looks 30 years out at the likely changes to our tax base and what that does to our revenue. It uses a national data set, IHS ARC market, and then that is used by the U of A Eller College of Economic Business Research. They will then do what they call the forecasting project, which looks at the Tucson and Phoenix markets and the statewide area in terms of economic forecasts. What we get is a forecast that looks out in nominal dollars or year of collection dollars, and then we deflate it. We look at it, what is the likely impact of inflation, and we deflated it. Our contract was originally to deflate it to $2024 because we wanted to use this as we were beginning to discuss the RTA next. And we also asked them to do it in $2022 so we get a sense of how much we're looking at in current dollars. The estimate acknowledges the impact of the post-pandemic economy, and more importantly, the potential for a near-term recession. They're actually recommending that we look at a pessimistic forecast. We want to be on the conservative side. And they do provide us 3 different forecasts. Their baseline, their most likely expectation of the economy in the future, an optimistic forecast, and then a pessimistic one. This is significantly higher than last year's forecast. And again, it reflects the higher prices and higher disposable income. And the baseline does assume a continued gradual recovery from the pandemic and the economy. Optimistic scenario is has a stronger growth, and obviously the pessimistic is more pessimistic. This is what we've seen in the RTA tax base, and this is looking backwards. So what you can see is the total estimated tax base of the RTA. The solid line and the shaded lines represent either a very short-term recession or a longer-term recession. As you can see, it's a fairly wide band in 2000, basically from 2008 to 2010. That's reflective of the Great Recession. Whereas we only saw a month of recession really in 2020, and that's reflected with that solid line on the right-hand side. But at that point, you can see almost a hinge in the trend. Now, what this shows is that, as I mentioned earlier, that our tax base returned finally to its pre-recession levels in 2018. Since that time, it's really taken off. Now, this is in nominal dollars. Now, if we look at that in terms of inflation adjusted, we're looking at finally only recently getting up to the level we were prior to the Great Recession. The Great Recession was a tremendous drop in our buying power. In fact, it's 26% drop that we saw over that period of time. And the recovery rate was pretty sluggish up until recently. If you look at it on a per capita adjusted basis, we're still not there. Now, this doesn't go all the way to the current date. This only looks to 2021, which is the most recent information that the U of A had. But you can see it is fairly steep in that period between the beginning or between the pandemic and the latest recorded information. But you can see that on a per capita basis, our tax base has not recovered from the Great Recession, even through 2021. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is, why is this happening? What's happening in our economy? And you can see on that graph that there's kind of a steady downward trend on the RTA's tax base relative to personal income. What that means is that we're shifting from purchasing goods and services, or purchasing goods to purchasing services. As we age, our consumption patterns change, and our economy is aging. And most notably, we are seeing an increasing shift in healthcare costs. Now, again, this only goes to 2020. You will see a bump when we get more data in the future. But this is the latest information that they have access to. And with the recession, we have seen some changes in consumption patterns. Frankly, a lot of healthcare expenditures were deferred in the early parts of the pandemic because you were basically well, a lot of people delayed procedures because of the threat of the pandemic. And and with the federal subsidies that have been paid out at the individual level, you've seen more consumption as well. This shows nationally the relationship between consumption of goods and disposable income. And if you'd looked at this last year, we presented this very same graph last year. And where you can see the pandemic line there, that big spike up, you can see that it's actually sustained for a year before it starts dropping off. If you looked at it last year, it would have been predicting a more rapid drop off. So our consumption of goods has been at a higher rate for a longer period of time than we expected. So and that probably is partly what's driving some of the inflation woes and supply chain problems that we're currently seeing, is because we as a nation are continuing to consume at a rate higher than we had prior to the pandemic. In terms of Pima County income growth, this is, in real dollars or nominal dollars, if you will, including inflation, as our expectation of that. If you'd looked at last year's projection, to the right, or on the right-hand side, you see the right of the vertical line in the middle representing the recession associated with the pandemic. You'll see it dropping off in terms of its growth rate. If you'd looked at this graph last year, it would have gone negative. Again, this is reflective of the kind of the sustained purchasing and the associated inflation and income growth that we've seen. And we see this depressing in the future, but it is not yet, it is not going negative as we had once anticipated. In the long term, we're forecasting about a 4.5% annual growth rate. It's up from the 4% annual growth rate, kind of the sustained level, and it's probably most reflective of a higher rate of inflation than we had anticipated last year. Looking at our revenue, again, this is nominal dollars, so this is year of collection. Our baseline forecast shows us growing from the $110.3 million that we collected in fiscal 22 out to fiscal 52 of $278.8 million. Now, we know it's not going to be a smooth line like that. The economy is cyclical and we'll see ups and downs, but that's representative of an average growth rate that we can expect. We know there will be periods of or economic downturns that will deviate from that line. But this, again, is an average. If we look at the yield, growth in yield for the RTA, again, we're looking at about 3% annually in nominal dollars. Now, I told you before that personal income was going to grow at about 4.5%. We're showing 3%. That's reflective of the difference is the shift between purchase of goods and purchase of services. When we look at the different scenarios, as I mentioned, we look at a baseline, we look at an optimistic and a pessimistic forecast. The one would expect, the lines to be parallel but not crossing. The reason that the pessimistic crosses the baseline is because it anticipates a higher rate of inflation. So that's why the revenue yield in nominal dollars, not in deflated dollars, crosses. However, if we look at it, adjusting it to 2024 dollars, we basically end up with, in the pessimistic forecast, a slight reduction in the amount of revenue to the RTA in the first couple of years, or the next couple of years, and then it returning to about a flat line amount of about $120 million a year. That's the 2024 value, basically no growth, as opposed to modest growth in the baseline and better growth in the optimistic forecast. So our estimate, this is valuable for us to look at the likely revenue that is going to be available to complete the 2006 RTA plan. The new baseline forecast for the plan between, basically our collection period between fiscal 27 or fiscal 07 and 26, fiscal 26 is now 1.72 billion, up about $40 million from last year's estimate of 1.68 billion. And all of these revenue estimates are likely to change. The only thing I can guarantee is that I'll be wrong.
Madam Chair, if I may, so the bottom line really was the last slide, if you all recall. Earlier projections, 2.1 billion, most recent update 1.7. And you all recognize that the difference was made up by using state and federal dollars. So, and we'll talk about it under the next item, but the region was able to make up that revenue reduction using state and federal dollars.
Thanks, Mr. Mohimi. I'd also add that that $1.7 billion is in nominal dollars, year of collection dollars, whereas the $2.1 billion plan was in 2006 dollars. So there's inflation that
we'll get into that under the next item. It gets a little bit more. This is the foundation for the next item.
With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Madam Chair. Jim, I'm sorry if I ask you questions that have been answered before in these meetings, because this is my first one. But I understand that decisions are being made about projects getting potentially considered for the, pushed out of this phase of RTA to the next one based on revenue shortfalls. And I'm just curious, I know these shortfalls are changing, with good news, on increases. And I'm curious, what is the process for, like, say we continue at this high rate of income, how do we decide if some of those projects get pulled back into the current phase of the RTA?
Okay. Madam Chair, Mr. Johnson, a great question. This is up to the board to decide how they want to handle this. Clearly we're all committed to finishing all of the projects. And if we do have those if those revenues are realized and we're able to continue moving forward with the projects, those funds will be made available. My expectation is those funds would be made available by the board. That would certainly be our recommendation to the board.
Madam Chair, it's the next item. We'll talk about it more, but I want to make sure everybody's clear. Cost increases are the cause of that, not revenue. It's the cost increases, but we'll talk more about it in the next item.
Thank you.
Other questions? Moving on to item 5.
Okay. Cost to complete. All right, Madam Chair, members of the CART committee, I'm going to review for you where we are in terms of our current estimates with cost to complete. I know within your package, you received a table that included this very specific cost estimates that we've identified. These are cost estimates that we worked out or would have conferred with our jurisdictional partners on and have gotten them, or they've confirmed that they represent our best estimate of the costs as of today. They do not include future inflation at this point. So with that, we are looking at a cost that we've identified for completing the remaining RTA project plans. The RTA board, as I mentioned on my board report, delayed 2 projects back in June. The Silver Bell Road project, stage 3, which basically is north of El Camino del Cerro. That's the project between El Camino del Cerro and Gore Road is one that is moving through the design process. We hope to see it bid shortly. We're hoping that it'll bid likely sometime after the first of the year and be into construction, hopefully before the end of the current fiscal year. The future stage of it, the one beyond El Camino del Cerro, is one that has been discussed about it as a potential expansion. And we know that Pima County has requested that this be delayed so they can have the conversation about expanding it from the 3-lane roadway that is in the RTA plan to a 4-lane divided roadway that both they and the town of Marana have suggested might be desirable. So that's going to be something that they've deferred and wish to discuss in the context of RTA next in terms of finding additional funding for that. RTA 13 is First Avenue between Orange Grove and Ina Road. That's a project that was also deferred, and it was deferred in part because their traffic forecasts are not suggesting that it really needs to be widened to a 4-lane roadway. In fact, it may be more appropriate to look at doing more of the complete streets types of improvements, adding in sidewalks where they don't exist, and making or providing safer bicycle facilities in that section of the roadway. So that is why Pima County asked that be delayed as well, or deferred. At its November meeting, the RTA board agreed to delay 2 additional projects. And this is following action by the Tucson City Council to delay as we look for additional funds. That 3rd stage of 22nd Street that I mentioned before, basically between I-10 and Keno, and Houghton Road, stage 8 between Broadway Boulevard and Tanque Verde Road. There's a desire to have, there's a potential for scope reductions on both of these projects, but they're going to require conversations with the community and as well as looking for additional funding. So these are probably 2 of the projects that would be later delivery items anyway. And so these were the projects that were suggested for delay. We're not talking about elimination, we're talking about delay. So 3 potential scope reductions, 1 potential scope expansion, and we still need to do some work on the cost estimating, although we have an idea of what the scope, the costs as the projects are currently scoped would look like. Okay, so if you exclude those 4 projects, we believe the cost of completing the remaining RTA projects, other than those 4 projects, is $736.1 million. There are some utility, when we do cost estimates for these projects, we look at them full boat. They include the costs of doing some utility relocations that are reimbursable by the utilities. We looked selectively at those projects for which this would apply, and then applied a 5% factor to it, which is about the average that we look at for the cost of those utility relocations. So that's how we arrived at our adjusted total roadway project costs estimate of almost $703 million. Now, one of the things that I know that everybody is interested in is, what does our funding situation look like? And we have in prior meetings had been saying this is our estimate of how much money we have available, and this is what the shortfall is. but we really haven't gone into great detail about, what the sources of revenues are, and inquiring minds want to know. So we have presented that here, and we're presenting the pessimistic forecast. And, when you ask what is pessimistic, what it means is that we're looking pessimistically at a number of different sources. One is our RTA sales tax collections, which, we're looking at a decline in revenue from what we are currently taking in on an annual basis during the short period that remains between now and the end of the RTA. And this is based upon the forecast that was provided to us by Eller, and Eller provides us a table year to year by source what our expected revenues are. So it's based upon their data. Additionally, we have some other items that we have something that's called MOE. It's short for maintenance of effort. It's basically transit funding together with federal grants that we get that are dedicated to transit, both in operations and in capital. So that helps subsidize those services that we have taken on from Pima County and the town of Marana and the city of South Tucson that we underwrite the operations cost of. So basically, it's now to the point where all of the Suntrans services are either paid for by RTA under this IGA, or the lion's share of it is certainly paid by the city, because most of the routes operate within the corporate limits of the city. But anything that goes extraterritorial, we pay for. Plus, we pay for the cost of enhancements that we contemplated in the RTA plan. So, running later on the evenings and weekends, things like that, covering costs associated with, we've got money in this year's budget for subsidizing Sunlink, things like that. The other area where we are looking at as being pessimistic is our regional 12-6 funds. We have some funds, it's regional 12-6 unprogrammed. That's based upon a forecast that Kristen Ward gave us back at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's reflected in the 2022 to 2026 tip. So we just held that. We actually believe it could be more than that, substantially more than that. But from a pessimistic standpoint, we felt that we would be best to stick with that earlier forecast.
It's 12-6.
12-6. There is a portion of the state highway fund is carved out and given to the two largest metropolitan areas in the state, Maricopa County and Pima County. Originally, it was called 15% funds. This, goes way back. Probably giving you more information than you'd care to know, but it's basically a 15.2% of the state highway fund is dedicated to those two areas, and then there's a 3/4, 1/4 split of those funds. We get 1/4 of it, which is actually pretty generous. And don't tell anybody I said that, but that is what we get of that state highway fund.
And it goes into the RTA.
It is by board policy committed to delivering the RTA plan to 2026. After that, that's yet to be discussed. That's something that's being discussed as to what we do beyond that point. So whether it's committed to, in fact, what we're recommending is that during the next planning period, we do a transportation improvement program, or TIP. We do that every 2 years now. And we're in the process of developing the TIP for fiscal year 24, fiscal year 28. And we're recommending that the last 2 years of those remain unprogrammed, so that if we need them to augment the RTA, we have that availability to do so. If it's not needed, then there'll be other opportunities for funding, and they'll be timely. I mean, we don't have to make that decision now for money that's coming in 5 years from now or 4 years from now.
Madam Chair, just to add, bulk of that money is your state gas tax that you pay.
Exactly. So anyway, bottom line, and you can't see this very well in this. I don't know why it's not sized correctly, but we have a total of $957.5 million of revenues under the pessimistic forecast. Now, I told you 702 million on project funds. That's not all we're going to pay for. So we'll talk about that next. We have the cost to complete. We got the $957.5 million of revenue. We have expenses that include almost $703 million of roadway projects, the projects that are not delayed. Plus, we have our categorical projects, safety, which is largely, at this point, it's mostly 2 intersections in the city of South Tucson. So we've got 2 projects on 40th Street, 40th and 4th and 40th and 6th are projects that we have about $1 million a piece in the program for that the city is available for, or it's available to the city. Balance of it is other small projects that have not finished yet, mostly hawk signals and things like that in the corporate limits of the city of Tucson. There's the environmental and economic and environmental. It's actually environmental and economic vitality is actually the name of the category. We've got $12.8 million in that. That's largely associated with bike boulevard and bike lane projects and some wildlife linkages projects. Plus that also covers the cost of our Main Street Business Assistance Program, which is about $500,000 a year. Or a little less than that actually. And then we have transit. Transit's the big number. And that's $132 million. That's the biggest other cost that we've got in there. And that right now is based upon, it's fairly conservative. It's based upon the services that we've been continuing to offer through the life of the RTA plan. We're not looking at any expansions that would be funded from this account. It's continuing what we're doing right now and absorbing the cost increases that are associated with the increased prices of fuel, dramatic 40% increase in the price of a bus. And that's not even converting it to electric. That's just that's what's coming out of Detroit over the last 2 years. And the cost of increased benefits or increased wages to our employees. So that's the estimate of what we think it'll take for transit. And we've got debt service. Those are the series 2013 and 2007. I'm sorry, 2014 and 2017 bonds. The 2011 bonds have been satisfied, fully paid off. So that's the remaining debt service that we have. We have $8.8 million in administrative costs. What that is it's 1% of our revenue per year goes to PAG. We also have to pay for costs that have been levied to us by the state legislature for the costs of collecting taxes. We have audit costs, and we have, including the 5-year audit. And we also have costs. We have a $2 million allocation in there for the cost of doing an RTA next election. So that's why that number is so high. Otherwise, it would be lower. So total estimated expenditures is $978 million. We still are short $21 million under this forecast, but we believe that's something that is a reasonable gap at this point.
Madam Chair, Jim, if I may. So it goes back to Ian's question here. The $700 million amount, the cost to complete projects, roughly 200 million of that are the projects that are being delayed. Another 200 million of that is actual cost increases. So, and we can break that down even more in the future discussions, but had that $200 million cost increase and the 200 million delay was not addressed, we would have had $400 million of additional cost increase. And this is only within the last 2 years. So that's where that's coming from, the differential.
Yeah, Mr.
Madam
Goshen.
Chair, Jim,
Oh,
my question is, if the voters don't approve the defers, that 400 million now come back into the budget.
So, Madam Chair, if I may, so the board is taking a really, I think, flexible approach to this. The goal is that let's put a new plan together, let's go back to the voters and let's identify the reasoning for why we need the additional funding to complete those 4 projects. And if the voters don't approve that, then they still have an option to come back and look at other regional funds, the perf dollars and federal dollars, to still complete those projects. So they have that flexibility. Obviously, the initial question is, let's go back to the voters. Let's understand the reason and the justification for the additional cost. Ask them if they want to vote and essentially support those additional projects.
Make changes, they have to vote under state law.
Exactly. So that's a reasonable approach to ask the voters if they wish to do that.
What time frame is it gonna be to ask the voters?
Sure, Madam Chair. Currently, the RTA, working through our citizens committee to develop a new plan. Our goal would be to go back before 2026, June of 2026 is when the current plan expires. So anytime before that, then we can answer this question of overlapping the 2 plans. Realistically, it could be end to end, that's fine, but I think the goal is to go earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Okay, well, so we've got just under $21 million of it that we're identifying as a current shortfall. Does not include the cost of the 4 projects that are being delayed, which it's about $197 million worth of costs in our current estimates. Those will be updated. And those are reflective of the current scopes, not a reduced or expanded scope. And obviously, the baseline, and if we're looking at more optimistic revenues, then it'll be a more favorable budget than we're reflecting. We've chosen to go pessimistic in part because we don't know what the future holds for us inflation wise. And when we saw the last recession, we did see construction prices go down. And we are looking right now at reduced home building activity, reduced construction activity in the region. So we may actually enjoy some better pricing in the future, but we can't predict that. But we felt it appropriate to tie the pessimistic forecast to the current construction cost estimates. Ultimately, it'll be the RTA board's decision on how they provide case-by-case funding. And we recommend that it be done as projects are ready for construction. Costs are going to move around. Let's keep the bulk of the uncommitted funding available to move on those projects as we know what those costs are. We're, again, as I mentioned, recommending delaying the programming of regional funds for fiscal years 27 and 28 for non-RTA regional projects in the event that they're needed to complete the plan. We encourage all partners to continue to pursue alternative funding sources, particularly federal infrastructure grants. We hope that RTA Next can be available as a supplemental funding tool, particularly for those projects that are either unfinished or there's a desire for expansion on them. And finally, revenues, as we've talked to them, are in nominal dollars. The expenses are in 2022 dollars. So again, that's something that we need to be mindful of. The RTA Next revenues will be needed to complete all the will be needed to complete all the projects unless other funds become available. And again, as I mentioned, actual construction costs may fluctuate. They're influenced by scope, the demand for building materials, labor costs and availability, contractor workloads and competitiveness, as well as the cost of oil, which certainly we've seen that be a tremendous factor in this past year. So that, I think, completes my, my presentation. And again, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Madam Chair. Yeah, I've got a few questions. And again, I apologize. if These have already been answered here before. When you say there are 3 projects that are delayed, is that all the projects that are currently marked as delayed for the next phase? Like First Ave, for example, is that still considered in that budget of 700 something?
Which First Avenue are you referring to?
The project there's the big First Avenue project between is it Grant and River?
Grant to River
Yeah.
is within and in the materials, you'll find and I know you can't see it, but there it is. There's a table that's in the materials that we supplied to you that reflects the costs of each of the individual projects that are part of that $702 million. And it does include $113 million for First Avenue between Grant and River. That is the city's opinion of what the current cost is to build a 4-lane version of First Avenue.
Okay. And so then my follow-up question is just, I'm a little confused by so we're getting revenue in current dollars, which are massively inflated compared to what, they were 20 years ago, but the costs, we're not considering those costs to also be adjusted. We're capping it, and just saying the RTA won't pay anything more than whatever the nominal fee that price was in 2006.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Mr. Johnson, that's partially correct. The partially correct part is that we are looking at nominal dollars, actual year of collection dollars, inclusive of inflation. The funding needs analysis, though, does include our estimate in current dollars for the construction, not 2006 dollars.
Okay.
We're trying to be, to match them up as best we can. Within the program, we have programmed up to the $2006 amount in our transportation improvement program. And beyond that, we have a fairly large balance that's available to us to plug in when we know what the actual costs are of projects. And so what we're recommending is that we make, decisions on funding as projects are ready for construction when we best know what those costs are going to likely be. So that's really what we're trying to achieve here, is leaving our, this may sound, we're trying to keep the funds available, keep our powder dry, if you will, so that we can respond to the emerging needs of these projects as they come forth and are ready for construction.
Madam Chair, if I may add to that. Thank you, Jim. Good question, but let me put it back in perspective of what we've done so far. So far, only 4 projects needed additional funding beyond what was in the RTA plan. And those 4 projects recently received roughly $42 million only within the last 18 months. So that's the approach we're taking. So up until now, every project was coming in at that amount. Recently, we've had over $42 million on top of that amount on those projects that were construction ready.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, if I may, those projects, and I mentioned earlier that the board had committed $17.5 additional million to the Downtown Links project. That's over and above the ballot amount. We also provided, I believe, $13.5 million to the Sunset Road project, which also had a changed scope, I would add. It actually, when we scoped that originally, that was to be an at-grade railroad crossing with Union Pacific. That was what was in the RTA plan that was approved by voters. That's not something that can be done now. And so the plan that has been bid by ADOT includes an overpass of the Union Pacific Railroad at Sunset. They recently awarded it, and that will be going to construction probably right after the first of the year. You'll start seeing that piece of Interstate 10 between the Ruthroth interchange and the Ina interchange will be widened, and they will reverse the grade on Sunset. Where Sunset currently goes under I-10, they will lower Interstate 10 at Sunset and take Sunset over the top of I-10 and over the railroad tracks and continue it over the Rito Creek with a new bridge and tie it into River Road. So there'll be an additional access point for people on the northwest side to reach I-10.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm happy to review anything, if it's helpful to catch you up on some things, and I appreciate your comments about being new. Yeah, this is good stuff. I'm happy to fill you in on anything else you'd like to know.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, one quick question.
Mr.
Inflation.
Long? She had her.
Oh, I'm
hand
sorry. I
first.
thought you addressed.
No,
it.
you're fine.
You mentioned an overlap. Will you explain what that would look like? Are you gonna be collecting a penny tax for the overlap period? Or are you gonna be double dipping? Is that what the intent is, to increase revenues?
Sure, Madam Chair, if I may. So the plan currently is to keep the tax rate at half cent. So basically what would happen is the revenue amount doesn't change, but the plan itself and what gets completed with that half cent would be in the new plan. So the actual revenue is still half cent for 1 year of overlap, for example.
So you're completing RTA 1 at the same time you're starting RTA next.
So by definition, it'll be a new plan. Once the voter approve it, it becomes the new plan.
So the things that have not completed in RTA 1, what happens to those projects?
They would be included in the new plan and the voters would approve the new plan.
Not the ones that have been approved to be put into RTA next. There's Grant
Anything.
Road. Grant Road is not going to be
Yeah.
done by 2026.
Good question. Good question.
So
So at
what
some point, it's basically saying, these are things that are done. Oh, there's a few things that are not done yet. As an administrative exercise, all that has to be in the new plan. So we're legally authorized to use the new money from the new plan to finish anything that's left.
So doesn't the RTA next now have to adjust their money to reflect all
Well,
the
that-
funding they will have to
Yeah, we're doing,
cover?
we're doing all that. We actually send out information to the board that factors in that overlap.
And there's numbers for that overlap?
Yes, we sent an email out last week and be happy to share that with you all. But again, CART is focusing on the current plan. So that's why you didn't receive that information about the next plan, but be happy to send it to you.
So the 1.1 billion that they're talking about for RTA next isn't 1.1 billion. It's
It
going
is
to be
one-
some lower number to cover
No, it's
RTA 1.
it's 1.1 billion of new projects. Or named projects. I'll send you the email. I think that'll help you a little bit. But again, since CAC is working on that, we didn't copy you, but I'll be happy to copy you all on other information as well.
I'd certainly like to see it, since it is RTA 1 that's being postponed and delayed. It's RTA next. I'd like to see
Sure,
those
we'll
numbers, please.
send you the letter.
Thank
It's
you.
spelled out.
Mr. Long?
Thank you. Inflation. Obviously, in a simplistic world, inflation obviously drives up our cost, but also increases our revenue. In a very simplistic world, that would be exactly even. Of course, it's not. So does inflation, what is that gap between that in increasing when inflation increases? How does that gap widen between our cost and our revenue?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Mr. Long, I don't know how I can answer that reasonably. What I can tell you is, and what you might find if you go through the packet of materials that we have provided in the August board materials. And I think I attached in your packets the complete minutes, which included all of the presentations, the slides on there. There's a couple of slides in there that look at inflation. Arizona Department of Transportation believes or has estimated that there's been between current date and the and 2016, there's been about an 88% increase in cost on construction.
Did you say 88?
88.
Wow.
That is not consistent with what we're seeing in other national indices. It is, inflation locally is, a function of local factors, obviously. And, one of the things is going to be demand. if you're in a very heated economy where there's a lot of competition, or a lot of, I'm sorry, not a lot of competition because there's a lot of work and it's difficult to get that work delivered, you're going to see greater costs. It's going to be less competitive at bid day. If you've only got one bidder or two bidders, you can imagine, how well a bid is going to turn out. Whereas if you had 10 bidders, like we were seeing during, the early post-recession years, it got really competitive because people were wanting to work. The competitiveness is a factor. If you were to look at, one of the things that we look at is there's a publication called Engineering News Record. And there are a variety of different, indices out there. I mean, you can look at it at GDP, you can look at it CPI, but the Engineering News Record 20 City Construction Cost Index is based upon, the cost of certain number of hours of labor, board feet of lumber, pieces of, pounds of structural steel, amounts of cement, that kind of thing. So it's intended to try to be representative of a cost index. And that cost index, while in Arizona, we're showing the local index that ADOT has produced as being 88% growth. The cost index with this 20 city index that ENR reports is only about 20% growth in the same period of time. So, I think we have to look at the local market. And, I think that, we observed here locally in the Great Recession, prices actually declined, whereas on the national level, they didn't. So there's a lot of difference between that. So, we don't have, you mentioned the simplistic inflation should equal, revenue growth. Yeah, that's probably what we used or were thinking early on in the RTA, but we've seen a departure from that, both to our benefit in the early years and to our detriment in more recent years. Did that help?
Yes, that helped a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Quigley?
Yes. I would just like to add that, given what I've seen in the industry right now and understanding fuel as a component of these construction costs, far outweighs what we see in typical consumer inflation. And right now, contractors can't find staff. They can't, in fact, cities and towns can't find staff to manage projects. And I think as Jim was alluding to, we are quickly approaching kind of saturation for contractors. And the other part of this is that as ADOT develops things, they also have their own set of contractors. What you're going to see at I-10 and these other things take away from capacity that we have in Tucson, thereby raising those prices even farther. So I really applaud what I've seen so far. And I think we're going to see other changes in this. The fuel is clearly a killer in all of this. Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Mr. Quigley. And in that same PowerPoint that's included, I do have the fuel factor and the bitumen factor, because the asphalt is actually, although it's an oil product, it actually doesn't track parallel to oil prices. The other thing to be aware of is that the war in Ukraine has caused a shifting in certain materials. For instance, the Ukraine and Russia are the biggest producers of pig iron, which is a contributor to ductile iron and cast iron, which are used in, extensively in waterworks. Some utilities in the past would only use ductile iron for their pipes. Well, if you don't have ductile iron available, or if this pig iron isn't available, it's going to increase the cost of recycled steel, which could be used to supplant that. So auto shred goes up, and you'll find users that have historically used ductile iron shifting from a cost standpoint to plastics, which then strains the plastic supply. So it's all connected. And unfortunately, we've got with the war in Ukraine, it's definitely, wouldn't think it would be affecting us that much in supply chain, but it really has.
So, Madam Chair, just a closing note, if I may, thank you for bringing that up, Andy, because realistically, if you look at it, we're talking about almost $1 billion worth of expenditures in 4 remaining years of the plan, when we spent 1.4 in 16 years. So we know that capacity is not going to be there. And that's the main reason for that delay and overlapping.
Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I had one question. Jim, would you mind going back to the slide that had all the line items for the expenses going forward? I just had a couple of questions about specific items.
Oh, I think I've lost control. All right. Is this the one?
No, it's the previous, I believe.
Now, the previous one was revenues, not expenses.
So the revenues, I'm sorry, I did mean revenues. That was my mistake. So I wanted to ask about the federal funds, because I know that a number of years ago, there was a decision to make a policy by the board to use flexible federal funds to make up shortfalls in construction costs. And I wanted to make sure I understood, is that still taking place? I assume that is still the policy.
That is the case. And in fact, you'll see, excuse our use of acronyms here. STBG, that line item on that table is surface transportation block grants, which are federal. So that's the federal money that I'm referring to, or that we referred to. And immediately below that is federal grants, which is that specific raise grant that was obtained by the city of Tucson for 22nd Street.
Okay, so the STPG, it does have a lot of funding in it. It can be used for programs, but the board has made a choice to use most of that is flexible for construction projects. Is that correct?
What the board did was they said that from a policy standpoint, this was a board action that took place in 2014. So they gave the jurisdictions time to adjust and, clean out the projects that were in the pipeline. But they said in 2014, they said, we recognize that there's this shortfall that's going to be coming forth. What we'll do is plan on allocating those funds between fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2026. All those regional funds that are discretionary on our behalf, we will use those dollars to support the RTA plan delivery so that we can get those projects done. They did not stipulate to which projects they would be associated with. We try to pick the projects that would be best delivered with the various sources of funds. For instance, some federal monies are hard to spend. So, what we've tried to do is put all those federal monies on projects that we're doing jointly with the state of Arizona. So for instance, that Sunrise or that Sunset project, we put a lot of federal money on that because the state's going to build it. The state will follow the federal procurement rules regardless. So it's an easy choice to put that money on that. Another project that we did that same thing with was, or had that same approach with, was Irvington Road. ADOT is rebuilding the Irvington interchange. We're going to tack onto it. Let's build it all as one project. We'll put our federal funds on that. So that's the way we've approached it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what I'm driving at is it seems like even with all those funds, we're still going to be short, right? I mean, we're clearly heading for not having enough funds to finish all the projects. And I wonder if this group would want to take a position on whether or not some of some portion of that is funding that was used for other programs before that is no longer able to because of the policy made by the board. And I wonder if this group would want to make a position to say, maybe we would have a discussion item in the future to look at those sources of funding and see what projects are no longer fundable because we're using it all for the shortfall. And I would suggest to the chair, Madam Chair, that I would be happy to work with you to potentially put a discussion item forward at a future meeting.
Madam Chair, if I just want to make sure I'm clear, you're talking about RTA projects?
What I'm talking about is I know that there, for example, Safe Routes to School had funding that was coming out of programmatic funds on the federal level, and then that money was gone, like it's
Yeah.
been,
We can-
swept
we can
to be
talk.
used all for construction. And I think this committee might have opinions about that if we had a discussion about it.
Yeah, we can talk about it later and I'll brief you on it, but this committee is really focused on RTA plan and RTA dollars. But we'll talk
Understood.
about it.
Yeah, well, all I'm saying is just that we're already not going to make it. So maybe this is an opportunity for us to say, well, maybe we can suggest to the board that, they could take some portion of that and relieve the pressure on all those programmatic funds. That's all.
Any other questions? Hearing none, thank you for attending. The meeting's adjourned.